Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Justice's discussion today on crimmigration and the intersection with the Black liberation struggle. We're very happy to have you here with us today, and we also thank Texas A&M Law Schools and specifically Luz Herrera for organizing this as part of the Network for Justice project. So just by way of a little bit of background, we have an hour here. We want to ensure that we get through some pretty critical questions with our organizers and our panelists. Prior to going into that, I would love to give you a little primer on what the Network for Justice is, so that you can understand the framing and also to discuss a little bit future programming that we have as part of the Network for Justice. So it is a project of the American Bar Foundation, when what we're really committed to is Latinx civil rights through collaboration with community organizations, practicing bar, scholars, law, students, policy schools, and activists. It's part of a larger umbrella project that is called The Future of Latinos in the United States, Law, Opportunity, and Mobility. And that focuses on how law and policy can shape the incorporation and inclusion of Latinidad across the nation. And we focus most primarily on 4 policy drivers: immigration, education, economic participation, and political and civic engagement. So today's panel, as I mentioned, is a broader speaker series sponsored by TAMU, and it really focuses on the intersection of immigration and Black Lives Matter. So the Network for Justice acknowledges and feels that we have to take seriously that we are in the midst of a critical social movement of reckoning, in which we're simultaneously acknowledging the specific and very unique pain that Black folks, including Black Latinx or Afro-Latinx people, experience, as well as recognizing that this infrastructure of immigration, detention, and removal is at its core a racial project. So while unfortunately scholars haven't engaged in these discussions very often, the reality is Black liberation and immigration have, since the beginning of the colonial period, been intertwined. The arrival, the forced removal and migration of Black bodies to the Americas rendered the Americas the largest population, having the largest population of Afro-descendants anywhere else. So these topics can actually not be separated from one another. And so we're really excited to welcome a distinguished panel of folks who will be talking about, through their own personal lived experiences as well as their intellectual journeys, to consider the ways in which we should, as activists and lawyers and future attorneys for the students out there, how can we actually brainstorm ways of moving forward for liberation for us all. So I'm happy to welcome Lisa Knox, who is the legal director for the California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. Lisa herself is a Afro-Latina and has lived her own experiences that have informed the work that she does. She was previously at the Centro Legal de la Raza in Oakland and has extensive experience working with detained communities across California. We're very happy to have her here. We're also thrilled to invite Donovan Grant, who is a formerly detained activist and organizer in Mesa Verde detention facility in Bakersfield, who organized tirelessly and endlessly to get people released from that detention center, and who himself experienced the violence of those spaces that are curated specifically to, sorry, for some reason, the PowerPoint is acting up. So we're happy to have him here. We also have Associate Professor of Law, Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez, who will talk a little bit about the sort of history, as well as his own, perhaps provide a little bit of insight into how law students can get involved in this fight. And I am the moderator, Pilar Escontrias. I am affiliated with the American Bar Foundation and am also a soon to be hopefully attorney. I just took the bar exam last week, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to continue this fight as a lawyer. I will be working for the California Appellate Project, working at criminal indigent appeals. So I think it would be helpful for us to start off a little bit with some questions for Lisa, who has experience in the last I don't know how long, Lisa, have you been working, doing this work? If you could give us a little bit of background as to how maybe immigration detention has changed over time, how this machinery has really developed, especially since the 1990s.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pilar, for that introduction, and for putting, to everyone for putting this panel on. And it's really interesting because, as Pilar mentioned, my personal background, I identify as Afro-Latina. My father is an African-American man. My mother immigrated from Mexico. So for me, for me, it's very personal. I think I've sort of lived at the intersection of the criminal, legal, and the immigration system, and have always seen those connections, and that connection between Black liberation and immigrant liberation. So really excited to be part of this panel. And so, for me, and since I'm a lawyer, I'm going to focus on sort of the legal framework around mass detention and how that's developed. And for me, it's really interesting because we see that is developed at the same time as this, modern framework for mass incarceration in the criminal context is developed. And we see a lot of the same rhetoric being used, right? So, going back to Ellis Island and Angel Island in the late 1800s, 1900s, there was immigration detention. But we really see it start to increase in the 1980s with Haitians and Cubans coming over in large numbers. And then we start to see in the 1990s, particularly under the Clinton administration, we start to see a real move towards large numbers of people being detained, right? And in 1996, we see the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act being passed, which, the name itself, I think, really invokes a lot of the tropes around that we also see used to describe the Black community around, people being irresponsible, needing to take personal responsibility for their actions. And so that really created this framework where, a lot of people who were permanent residents became deportable. It expanded a category of something called aggravated felonies, which aren't all felonies, can be minor crimes. And suddenly a lot of people who have green cards and who may have been in the US for decades, suddenly are subject to deportation. And it also created something called mandatory detention, where a lot of those same people, because of their criminal convictions, weren't eligible to be released for detention. So we start to see, in the 1990s, this huge increase in the number of people in immigration detention. And, it's interesting to me that this also coincides with the development of private detention facilities, right? So we see the first permanent immigration detention center in the US was a core civic facility that's privately run by this corporation that opened in the 1980s. And since then, we've gotten to a place where now 81% of people in immigration detention are in these privately operated facilities. And Congress actually had a bed quota from 2009 to 2017 that mandated there are at least 34,000 beds available at any time for detaining immigrants. So we've really seen that, as this mass detention system and this legal framework develops, you also see private operators expanding. And I think it's no coincidence that the two things happened at the same time. And it's also no coincidence that, this was happening at the same time that we're seeing the criminalization of the Black community, and a lot of the same tropes that are being applied there being applied in the immigrant context.
Great, thank you. And for CESAD, during that time period, as Lisa mentioned, you're seeing the rise of mass incarceration, and yet it's interesting because while there are so many parallels, at the same time, there are no mandated quotas for jails, right? There are the private industry, at least to my knowledge, there are no mandated quotas that are written into contractual obligations between local entities and the private companies that detain folks. So can you talk a little bit about maybe continuing on this discussion of the changes between the sort of federal laws perhaps that allowed for mass detention and mass incarceration to accelerate at the rate at which they did, and also to allow them, like how do they interact with one another, right? If you can tease that apart for us. And you're on mute, Cesar. And I
Sorry.
also just really quickly, I'm sorry, before I go on, again, it was written in the notes. I failed to mention at the beginning that although some of us are attorneys or will be soon attorneys, none of this should constitute any legal advice. And to the extent that you are seeking assistance in any matter, you should consult with your own legal advisor. So I'm sorry for disrupting the flow of that, but I did want to get that out there. So Cesar, I'll hand it over to you.
No, thank you. Yeah, so the connection between mass incarceration in the criminal justice context and the immigration prison practice that has been rampant over the last several years in the United States is one that I hesitate to describe it as two trends that run in parallel with one another, because I actually think of them as being just two aspects of the same trend. That is this widespread embrace of incarceration that really develops quite dramatically in the 1980s, as beginning in the 1980s, as Lisa pointed us to earlier, and gains bipartisan support beginning in that period. And that has by and large not waned. So we see that administration after administration, presidential administration after presidential administration, Congress after Congress, regardless of whether it's being led by Republicans or Democrats, there has been this willingness to lock up people through various options. Most of us are very familiar with the way that phenomenon has developed in the context of the war on drugs, the federal and state government's decision to criminalize illicit drug activity, use, and commercial activity quite heavily beginning in the 1980s, and incarceration forms an integral part of that. And of course, the work of people like Michelle Alexander and in the New Jim Crow has brought a lot of the development of that policy to the attention of many people, and that's entirely positive. But I think the flip side is equally momentous, and that's the way in which imprisonment in the immigration law enforcement context has also developed in this very same time period. And it wasn't simply during the same political moment, during this fervor that developed in the 80s and then throughout the 90s and so on, to target migrants and other people of color with incarceration, but it was in fact the very same pieces of legislation that were critically important to the development of the war on drugs related incarceration practice and the immigration prison practice that exists today. So we can think of laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which is famous or infamous for having initially introduced the enormous crack and cocaine sentencing disparity, this 100-to-1 crack cocaine sentencing disparity. But it also expanded the power that the Immigration and Naturalization Service, so the predecessor to today's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, has to expand its resources by first seizing drug assets, and secondly by also simply detaining more people. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 is the first time in which Congress folds into immigration law the beginnings of a policy practice that our law enforcement practice that's very common today, which is the decision by ICE to issue a detainer, an immigration detainer against people. 2 years later, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 provides something like $200 million in funding for federal prisons in 1 year alone, in 1989 alone. But it also allows the INS to forfeit, that is to seize and use the proceeds of those sales of property of all kinds that was seized in the course of drug activity, of investigating and drug crimes. And then they could use that to buy vehicles for the INS, to buy aircraft for the INS. But most importantly, actually, going back to a comment Lisa made about the evolution of this concept called the aggravated felony, well, that gets incorporated, that gets introduced into immigration law, courtesy of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And we see that over and over again through the 1990s and so on, that laws that are ostensibly about illicit drug activity also incorporate enormously significant immigration law provisions. And we see the inverse too. Laws that are sold as being focused on enforcing immigration law, promoting compliance with immigration law, include some really significant provisions that target illicit drug activity. And then post September 11th, 2001, we see a similar dynamic playing out with regard to so-called anti-terrorism measures, including, most importantly, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, within which ICE and the Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol agencies are currently situated within the federal government. So these phenomenon are developing rapidly at the legislative level with regard to the actions that Congress is taking. And they're happening also by creating a more seamless relationship between the federal immigration officials on the one hand and their partners in state and local law enforcement agencies on the other hand. And so that helps to move us away from a situation in which we had a criminal justice system that operated in its own sphere, and in an immigration justice system that operated in those sphere, and one in which there's a fairly seamless, these days, there's a fairly seamless relationship between these two entities, so that I think of it as the relationship between local police officers in cities and towns across the United States and the ICE officers who staff immigration prisons and deportation flights as being a single immigration prison and deportation pipeline, rather than two bureaucracies or two sets of law enforcement entities that are operating independent of one another and sometimes interact quite the contrary. I think that at this point, thanks to some of the legislation that's in policymaking that's been happening going back several decades now, it's a seamless stream that wouldn't even be accurate to call it a transition from one to the other, because they're so heavily intertwined.
So Cesar, you mentioned how, thank you for identifying the ways in which mass incarceration and immigration detention really became popularized in the academy as well as in public consciousness in the last decade, right? In particular, you mentioned Michelle Alexander's work. You identified the role of legislative action in creating what you identify as a seamless relationship between the criminal injustice system and the immigration system and the pipeline that therein exists. But of course, as we know, folks in immigration detention and folks who are incarcerated, by virtue of their own lived experiences, have long recognized many of these things that academics are now writing about. And so I really want to pivot here to Donovan. I'm especially curious to hear about what your experiences are, having been in immigration detention, and how you may compare that with your experiences in the criminal legal system.
Yeah, first I want to address, Lisa says this started in the 1980s. What I want everybody to know, this, was way before the 1980s. This started so long ago, like maybe over 100 years ago. And, this is like a new way of modern day slavery in a way. So, I don't want nobody to get it twisted. You know what I'm saying? This is a new way of, it's not no minority, minority is basically, when they say minority, minority is just Black and Hispanics, people with, you know, with color, you know, and, you know, the white is exempt. You know, they system for the white people and the Blacks and Hispanics is totally different. You know, it's two different systems. You know, because I've been in the federal system, wherein I learned so much about the prison system, how it works, and
I found this on the web.
When you go to court, you know, the rules and the laws is totally different, you know, between us, meaning the Black, the Hispanic, and it's so different from the white. You know, we can be charged for the same charges, and, you know, the white man will get, you know, probation, and then the Black man or the Hispanic will get, you know what I'm saying, time in prison. And, you know, it's so ironic to the fact that, you know, even in my circumstances, you know, I see people that, you know, came in on worse charges for rape and stuff like that. The white people, you know, the white guys will come in and, you know, sooner or later they get $20,000 bond, you know. So it's two different systems for two different, you know what I'm saying? They try to basically say you felons or we felons, just to the fact that they can keep us, you know, in this bubble. You know, they keep us in this bubble by branding us as felons, you know, and, you know, other people like the white will get, you know, probation or misdemeanors for their crimes. And, you know, it's just to keep, you know, us at bay in a way. So it's very crazy. I experienced, you know, a lot of stuff where it's more privilege, you know, to white, and then the Black and the Spanish, they will just treat us like, you know what I'm saying, okay, we take a deal for this particular person, okay, we 5 years or 6 years, you know what I'm saying? There's no chances. There's never no chances for Black or Hispanics at all, you know. So we was put in a system to fail, automatic, you know, because when I got arrested, you know, they say, you was arrested for such and such. But what I was arrested for, they arrested me for drugs. But when they did they research and see that, you know, it wasn't a controlled substance, and they still charged me for drugs. How can you charge somebody for drugs, but still yet it's not a controlled substance? You know, when they did their testing. So as I say, the system is so crazy, because I think, you know, the way the system was designed is once you in, you in. And if you in, we gonna brand you as a felon. And once you a felon, you know what I'm saying, you can't get nothing done, or this gonna be like a bug in your system that, you know what I'm saying, we control you for the rest of your life. You know, and you know, the immigration system, when I left there, you know, they picked me up. I've been here since, you know, as a kid. I went to school here, everything. I got my kids here, all that, you know. And when they picked me up, right, because I did everything in the federal facility. I did, you know, English, you know, how to be a parent. You know, I did my diploma. I did hard work. I did, you know, I did so much. I got like maybe 100 certificates, you know, so, you know, and it didn't even matter in a way, you know. And my counselor, you know, said, my final week, you know, my final week in the federal facility, my counselor came to me and said, man, you know, I wish you all the best in the world. You know, you was a good guy. You know, you was the rep here, and you know what I'm saying, you kind of hold stuff down for us. You know, you shouldn't have a problem. And then that day, immigration came and got me, you know, when I was being released. So I went over there to immigration and I say, you know what, you know, there's no way I'm going back to a country that I don't even know. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, I met a few guys over there that was over there fighting, and, you know, we organized, and, you know, we were saying, boy, you know, we got to do something about this immigration and this, you know, criminal system, because, you know, I think it's just unfair. And, you know, a lot of guys that was there before me, you know, it was so sad, because I could see, you know, guys at times on the phone, you know, having, oh, their mom died, or, you know, and I think immigration should be a civil case, a civil matter. I don't think you should be, after your prison time, you should be in a system where it's even worse than even the actual prison that you was at. You know what I'm saying? Because the medical system there, it sucks. They treat you like you still a criminal, like you still doing time. So you finish your time, but still yet you still doing time. And, you know, I can see people, you know, they family member, their kids getting out of hand because their parents is not around. And, you know, even guys that, you know, never had not even one conviction on their record, but because they was picked up by the police, they put them into that system, you know, and it's just sad, you know, because I don't think us, especially me, should, you know, be away from your kids. And, you know, I think every kid should have their parents around, no matter how it is. You know what I'm saying? We have American born, you know, American born kids, you know, and I think every kid need their parents, you know, at least keep them grounded in a certain way. You know, a kid without a parent around, you know, they seems to stray, you know, and do other stuff, maybe, you know, illegal stuff, or seems to get into trouble a lot, you know. So I think, you know, it's better, you know, having parents around at all times. And, you know, I see, just for a civil matter in immigration, I see people died in jail, in immigration system, I should say. And a good friend of mine's, he was, you know, we always, you know, this Asian dude, his name was An. He was like 70-some years old. And every morning we'll get up early, and we'll get up and we'll talk, and we will say, like, An, what's up, man? And you get up and, like, he was like, what's up, bro? You know, but in the immigration system, we all like brothers. We more tighter than ever, you know, because we have Blacks, we got Asians, we got Hispanics, we got people from all over the world, you know, people that, a lot of these people have kids and family and moms and dads here, you know, never had a problem in their whole lives. And when I see, from actually seeing how the system was ran there, and this old man, Han, you know, he just finished his time, came there to immigration, and he's 70-something years old, and I see him, you know, trying to survive, you know, excited, like, yo, I'm trying to go see my family, excited, you know, like, okay, I want to get released. I got to go spend some time with my grandkids and stuff like that. I'm like, yo, man, it will be okay, you know, everything gonna be okay. This man had so much medication. Sometimes I got to be like, you sure you know what you're taking? Because they give him all this medication, like, you know what I'm saying, to, like, take on your own, like, administer on your own, you know? And I was like, yo, you're taking a lot of medication, man. You sure you exactly know what are you taking and the time period you should be taking it in, you know, the time, you know? And it was like, oh, I know. I said, okay, no problem. And when the COVID came in, you know, I say, man, I don't think you should be here. You know, I don't think a lot of these guys should even be here, you know, because, you know, it's a lot of people, and I see a lot of people here sick, man, and They don't do no type of testing. They don't, I don't know, people can be coming in and out, people always coming in and out, in and out, in and out, because they try to keep the bed at least filled at all times. So every unit will have like over 100 people in every unit. Bunks all lined up next to each other, like maybe 2 feet apart, up and down, top and bottom. And, he was right across from me, and the COVID came in, and then I see a lot of people getting sick, and they sneezing and they coughing, and I'm like, you know what, we got to do something pertaining to this. So I spoke to some of the reps. I was the reps for the others, meaning the whites, maybe a few white that was there from other country, like England and stuff like that. We had like 2 white dudes there. So I'm the rep for the others, meaning the Asians, the Africans, and so forth. And I spoke to someone because the Spanish majority is the biggest population in jail. The biggest population. Since I've been in the system for 4 years, I don't think I ever seen 10 white folks at all, not even 10. And when they do come in, they come in and they go right back out. You know what I'm saying? So it's so crazy, because I'm like, when you look around, all you see is like Hispanics and Black. That's all you see. And I'm like, okay, we gotta come together, and we gotta form a group of guys, and we gotta talk to our people, and we gotta organize, and let them people know that, they can't hold us for a civil matter. Even a lot of us is fighting our case. We don't think we should be in this type of environment, with no bleach, no soap dispensary, no paper towel dispensary, nothing. And, the cops be coming in and out, and sometimes they never have a face mask at all. And then, we send a note, to the warden, and we send a note to the warden saying, meaning that, we need, bleach, we need, social distancing. And they just brush it off. Every time they just brush it off like, just fight your case or whatever. So we start organizing, and I put a few of the guys together, and we started to basically refuse a lot of stuff. We start refusing, going to trial. And, we started we not going to trial for 3 days. And, we went outside on rec. We let everybody clear out the old dorm and went outside. And when we went outside, normally we go outside for an hour. And when we go outside for that hour, we decide, we form a circle, and we say, we're not going back inside. We need this, we need that. And then they call ICE, they call the warden, they call, a few people up, and, they start asking us questions. They call a couple of the reps over, and they was like, what's the problem? And, it's going to be a problem, and people going to start get shipped out because, we outside, and we don't want to come in, and we got drones flying around now, and they don't want that attention. And, it was a big thing. So they asked us what we want. And we say, but basically, a lot of people's here, is sick. And we need some type of hygiene product, like, lotion, soap dispensaries, or, at least some bleach or disinfectant to, take away the germs and stuff like that. And they promised us for a week. It didn't go as planned, so we decided not to go to commissary. We still gonna go on fasting. We not gonna do none of that. And they keep calling us down and say they're gonna do that, but they gotta go to their people, and they gotta go to ICE administration, and it was just a whole bunch of runaround. And then we start taking it very serious, and then and then it started getting worse, and people started getting sicker, and and then that friend of mine's on. They transferred him. They took him out of the dorm, brought him downstairs, and I never heard from that man again. 2 days after I heard On died. You know, and you know that was so crazy because that man was full of life. Everybody knew Han, you know, and when he died, it's like everybody just took it to a different level because you know what I'm saying. I said people is really dying, and that man wouldn't even hurt. I don't think that man would ever hurt himself, you know. And they was trying to say, oh, I think he killed himself, you know, and he didn't want to be there. That's why he killed himself. That's a whole bunch of crap, you know. And when he died, we formed a tighter grip. You know, everybody started forming together, and then we start demanding stuff. They try to get us to go down there and eat, and we say, no, we're not going, you know. And they threaten us, oh, we're going to stop your commissary, we're going to stop your money, we're going to stop a lot of stuff. And some of the guys, you know, is really sick because we wanted to stop taking their medication because all they do when you go to the medical, they always ask you, oh, what's wrong with you, or, you know, ibuprofen. Every situation that you go to medical for, they always issue you one thing, ibuprofen. And I was like, yo, why they always try to offer you ibuprofen for every situation you have? That don't make no sense. So, you know, we try to refuse medical and stuff like that. But a few of the guys that was there that was on insulin and stuff like that, you know, we let them go because they have to take the insulin because they're going to die without the insulin. And, you know, that's where we started. We started the pushing, you know, with a few the ACLU lawyers, and we start pushing and we pushing and pushing. They start taking out people and start releasing people. At first, they release all the females, and they start spreading people out. So the female, they had their own dorm, which was 120 females. So they got rid of all the females first, and then they start taking some of the guys from different dorms to the female dorms. So, and then they broke it down to like 60 people, but it's still not social distancing because everybody uses the same set of stuff, the same showers, the same toilet, the same sinks, you know what I'm saying? People lined up to go to chow at the same, you know what I'm saying? So it wasn't working. And then, we started to push, and then they start releasing some of the guys, you know, and then I end up gotten released, you know, like they say, yo, get this guy out of here because this guy is creating too much of an issue, you know. So, you know, I end up being on, you know, but even though I came home, I still can remember and I still can, you know, feel these guys that been away for so long in immigration for 2-3 years. How can you be in immigration for 2-3 years? I left an older guy down there. He was fighting for almost 4 years in immigration. And that was so sad, you know. So I'm here, I'm still, you know, fighting. You know, a lot of news media call me every now and then, you know, just to ask me, you know, a few questions or what's going on or how can they help or whatever. So the fight still goes on.
Well, we're grateful to have you in that fight. And I think you brought up a lot of really critical questions surrounding, you know, anti-Blackness, organizing within the system as you're a detained person within that system, and the lack of adequate healthcare. And we actually had a question about the ways in which, you know, especially during the COVID pandemic, healthcare has not been a priority of discussion. And again, in light of, for folks who don't know, there was a recent whistleblower complaint out of Georgia related to inadequate health situation in a detention center, as well as forced hysterectomies. And so these conversations are absolutely critical. And we also had another question from a participant asking what our definition of liberation is, because all of us actually have used in some way or another the idea of liberation as we answer our questions. So if I would love to talk a little more explicitly about how this work relates to Black Lives Matter specifically, and why does the fight for immigrant justice have to include a struggle for liberation of Black folks, right? Like, why is that critical? It absolutely is. And so if we can talk through, panelists, I'll open it up to whomever, if Lisa wants to step in, Cesar, what do we learn from BLM, right? And this, I think this goes directly to some of Donovan's work as well, because as Donovan mentioned in his organizing, you know, you invoked a lot the people who were lost at the hands of law enforcement, right? Like, loss is at the center of a lot of your work. You had a statement that was released and you invoked Breonna Taylor, Oscar Grant, and that you do this protest in their memory as well. So I think like centering our discussion around that, Lisa and Cesar, do you have any observations about why and how we can and must engage BLM more in our work as immigrant justice advocates?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, well, I think one thing we've learned from, Black Lives Matter is, folks have been really intentional about centering, even in the Black community, the most marginalized Black folks, right? So like queer and trans Black folks, right? And the idea that like, we're not truly free until the most marginalized among us is free, right? And if we sort of focus on the most marginalized folks in the group and in the system, right? And how do we lift up those folks and fight for their liberation, right? Through that, all the rest of us will also achieve liberation. And so I think, in the immigrant rights movement, some of the most marginalized folks are Black folks. So for me, it's also remembering that it's the intersection, right? And that, as Donovan mentioned, who's in immigration detention? It's primarily Black and brown folks, right? Who is most impacted by our immigration system? It's Black and brown folks. And I think right now we're seeing, as someone mentioned in the questions, the situation on the border, what we're seeing on the border, and before COVID, I was going down there myself to try to provide services to asylum seekers, but we're seeing disproportionately that Black folks are those asylum seekers that are stuck at the border trying to get into the US and claim asylum right now. There's a lot of folks from various African countries. There's a lot of Afro-Honduran folks and Afro-descendant folks from other parts of Latin America, right? So I think part of how they're connected is that in some ways it's the same movement, right? And immigrant liberation and Black liberation are intertwined in a lot of ways in this country.
Bilal, you're on mute. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. Cesar, it would be helpful if you can weave that in perhaps to a discussion about how to end this system of immigration prisons, since you have given a TED talk on it. Can you provide some of the major reasons why we need to do this and how we can think through ways to move this conversation forward toward abolition?
Yeah, certainly, Bilal. So I think we have to be willing to start moving in the direction of abolishing immigration imprisonment, frankly, because we know what happens if we do not move away from the current state of affairs. Just in the last few weeks, we've had multiple courts that have found that ICE has little regard for the lives of people in its care, and these are courts that are not particularly sympathetic rather to the plight of migrants. And there are many technical means by which they can avoid weighing in these questions. But despite that, here's how one court described the process that ICE used to decide how many people could safely be kept in an immigration prison in Adelanto, California. There, the ICE official in charge, in the words of the court, imagined in his head that every detainee had a sphere around their body that measured 3 feet in every direction. He did not measure any common area, did not measure any cell, did not measure any bed, did not measure any table, did not measure any hallway, and did not measure any other area. So this disregard with which ICE treats the people in its custody. So it's not a surprise that by October 1st in this facility alone, there were at least 114 confirmed cases between migrants who were detained and also staff. So legally, there are 2 permissible reasons for ICE to detain somebody: because somebody's dangerous or because they might flee. But that claim falls apart when we notice that ICE, for example, locks up children. One child who I I wrote about in my most recent book, Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants, was detained initially when he was just 1 year old. And he was 2 years old while he was still detained. And he turned 3 while he was still detained, right? So he was in there for multiple years. And yet ICE points to the fact that its justification, its legal justification, is that people might not show up to hearings, that people might endanger the community. ICE has very little credibility upon which to make these claims. In another judicial decision from a federal court dealing actually with the Mesa Verde Detention Center, the court summarized the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then came to this conclusion. It said, ICE has lost the credibility to complain and has lost the right to be trusted. Right. So what happens? Why should we move away from imprisoning migrants? Because we know the human consequence of doing what we're doing. We know that the legal basis, the legal justification that they're using falls flat on its face when we poke just beyond the surface. And we know that the entire regime of immigration law is one that is rooted in various iterations of racism. Immigration laws anchored in our nation's original sin, slavery. The Constitution's only explicit reference to migration comes in the form of the Migration Clause. It's a bar on congressional attempts to stamp out slavery before 1808. The country's first naturalization law, the law that allows people to become citizens if they weren't born as U.S. citizens, limited full participation in our political community to free white persons. And so the way in which that racism appears has changed time and time again. The particular target of the racism has changed time and time again. But what hasn't changed is that just beneath the surface, if not on the surface of immigration law, from the very first moments of the nation's founding, we see that it is heavily influenced by racism, and I think the experience that Donovan was sharing about his own time incarcerated illustrates just that point.
I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, in the last few minutes that we have, how do we raise awareness? How do we engage media more to discuss these issues of this interconnectedness? How do we, for example, center the voices, Lisa, as you were discussing, the voices of the most marginalized, right? The trans folks, the folks with disabilities. How do we center that discussion when we're talking about an issue that's already that many people already refuse to actually acknowledge, right? Like, many people in our society refuse to acknowledge that there does need to be an abolition movement. So even getting folks to that point is difficult. How do we then really have these more sophisticated conversations, right? About anti-Blackness, about organizing, as Donovan has highlighted for us. Like, how do we do that? Do we use the media? Is the media and I'm bringing this specifically from a question from a viewer out there. So can we talk through that a little bit? Maybe we'll start with Donovan. You mentioned while you were having your hunger strike, there were drones flying over. That the part of the problem, right, that the people in power had with it was that it was getting too much attention. Can you just talk through that briefly with us?
Yes, as I say, you just got to highlight the situation as is. You know, we can't sugarcoat nothing. We just got to put it out there as it is. You know, and you got to show the media what is really going on. You got to put it out there. You know, I have pictures of people that were sent back to their country in the middle of the street, murdered. You know, the media you got to show the media, you know, these type of stuff. You know, families here, American citizens, dad was sent back, you know, and was slaughtered. You know what I'm saying? His head cut off, his body, you know, in the middle of the street. You know what I'm saying? So once you start highlighting these situations that's occurring on a regular basis, then people will start gravitating and see the realness of what's really going on.
Maybe Cesar or Lisa can talk about, especially in the midst of the Trump, the situation with Trump since post 2016, what are some tools that we can use as activists in engaging the media?
I think particularly as a lawyer, and somebody with access to folks in detention who are so marginalized and so isolated, I think one of the tools that we have is our access to folks who are impacted by the system every day. And so one thing that, as Donovan said, right, that's really powerful is, I can talk all day to the media about what the situation is like in detention right now. But having folks who are in detention explaining that is so much more powerful and compelling, right? And they can tell their own story much better than I can. So I think for me, one thing that has been really important, and I think that has also really resonated with the media and with the public, is lifting up those stories of directly impacted folks.
Cesar, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share about that as a historian of this process?
Yeah, no, I think for me, as an academic, I think where I can weigh in best is to try to provide some of the context in which this kind of decision-making process has played out in at different moments in the nation's history. And the thing that I turn back to is a moment in 1954 when we had a Republican in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, and we had a practice at that point of jailing migrants in places like Ellis Island, and then earlier on in the 20th century in Angel Island out in the West Coast. And yet the Eisenhower administration at the end of 1954 announced that it was going to be closing down several of those facilities, including most importantly the one on Ellis Island. And it's not because all of a sudden there were no people who were violating immigration law. There were. In fact, there were still people there who were just released into Manhattan, put on ferries, and then who knows what happened to them. And it's not because all of a sudden the hearts and minds of decision makers in the White House and in the Justice Department, which at the time was responsible for immigration matters, changed, and they took a more sympathetic view of migrants. 1954 is the same year in which Operation Wetback was responsible for rounding up Mexicans, including U.S. citizens, and deporting them. But what happened was that the politics of the moment changed. And the 1954 was the moment in which the Soviet Union was rising, was regaining its power after the pounding that it had taken during the war, during World War II. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had already faced off in a proxy war in Korea in the early 50s. And and the Cold War was beginning. And in the Cold War, the Eisenhower administration realized that we needed allies. And one obstacle to gaining allies was treating their citizens poorly. And so the Eisenhower administration came to view its immigration policy, specifically its policy of imprisoning migrants, as part and parcel, as part of the country's national security strategy. So I think it's valuable to try to change hearts and minds. But for some people, that's never going to happen. And so while we're waiting for all of the hearts and minds, and while we're doing the work of changing those hearts and minds, I think changing the politics of the moment are equally important. Changing the political pressures that are applied, that key decision makers are facing, so that it becomes untenable. It becomes impossible for them to continue to lock up migrants because we're ostensibly afraid that they're going to endanger the public, or afraid that they're going to disappear into cities and schools throughout the United States. And that is something that I think we can continue to do. I think that is something that we should continue to do. To the extent that the private corporations are engaging in imprisoning migrants for the sake of profit off of human bondage, then raising the costs of that practice is enormously valuable, and we're seeing that in places like it happened in places like California at a state level, but we're seeing that in communities, cities, and smaller towns throughout the country in smaller, in one instance at a time. And so I think the politics of the moment are as important as changing the narrative that affects the way in which people view migrants and migration itself.
Mm-hmm. So in our last 5 minutes now, I'm hoping that perhaps we can all answer one of the questions that was submitted prior to the registration here about making the connection again between BLM, Black Lives Matter, and the fight for Black liberation and immigration rights. If there is one takeaway that you can give as an activist, as an organizer, as an academic, in terms of coalition building, right? Like, how do we actually build bridges from one another? From me to you, from you to me, right? From all of us who have very different identities. Like, I'll just start by saying that I think the most important thing is recognizing our own privileges. I am a Latina, but I'm a white presenting Latina. I navigate through the world very differently, right? And I'm a woman who's cisgendered. I think like naming these things are really critical. That's, for me, the number one place to start. And I would love to hear from the rest of our panelists where you think the starting point is for actually getting a coalition built to start to dismantle some of this stuff, to abolish it. So Donovan, as the one who really put together a coalition of people from very different backgrounds during your strike, what do you think, what was the first starting place for you all?
The first starting place is just to get everybody involved that is in the same situation. Because as I say, people from all over the world is in the same situation, you know what I'm saying? And as long as you get people together, you know, they say unity is strength. You know, so we just got to all come together, you know what I'm saying, and just make one big voice, you know, even, you know, as I say, you know, even if it's going to take a march or, you know, we just form, you know, people from all backgrounds, you know, come together and voice, you know, their experience, you know, and I'm telling you, it's a lot of people with different experience. You know, so that's what we got to mostly do. We just got to come together at one big force.
Great, thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. Yeah, as Donovan said, you know, kind of recognizing that we are all in this together, right? And that, as I said earlier, you know, it really is the same system that's impacting people in the same way. And I think with COVID, we've really started to see this, right? And in California, which I know is a little different than a lot of states, but you know, people are locked up and dying in prison, in California state prisons. People are also locked up and dying in these private for-profit detention centers. And you know, we've really been able to all come together and realize that, you know, this is the same system that's killing people, and also have common targets, right? So, you know, I was honored to participate along with 13 other lawyers and activists and undocumented folks at a direct action that we did at Governor Gavin Newsom's house in California, demanding that he take action to free folks from jails, prisons, and immigrant detention centers, right? So we all realized that the target there and the person who had the power and potentially could be moved was Governor Newsom in that situation. And so we were all able to come together around that common target and those common demands. And I think as lawyers, you know, being willing to kind of step outside our comfort zone and do things like, you know, if you're able to and you feel comfortable getting involved in direct action, right? And getting involved in ways that aren't necessarily strictly legal and showing up for folks, I think really goes a long way towards building those bridges and those coalitions.
So I think that it's essential that we consider the criminalization of migrants, the exploitation of Black people, regardless of citizenship status, as a matter of racial justice. But I think it's also one that carries enormous class exploitation components. And the best example of from recent history that I can point to is actually what's playing out with regard inside immigration prisons in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So yes, detained migrants are getting sick. Some of them are dying, but guards are too. And those guards are are going in and out of the facility. And so they're taking this illness, this virus, into the communities that they live in, including to their families. And these are often rural, these are isolated, these are poor communities with limited health infrastructures. And yet ICE's cavalier posture, that one quote that I quoted from, it said, you know, we can't trust ICE, they can't be trusted. You know, that doesn't just affect the migrants who are locked up forcibly, but it affects all of these folks. And the other thing that I think is invaluable to think about, especially right now, is that no matter what happens in a few weeks, no matter what happens with the outcome of the election in November, immigration prisons are going to continue unless they are forced to stop. The biggest immigration prison population in the history of the United States was under President Obama until President Trump. And so reversion to the pre-Trumpian days is certainly to be welcomed in many, many ways, but it certainly is going to be far from idyllic, and will involve many hundreds of thousands of people who are locked up every single year, while Core Civic and the geo groups of the world make a ton of money off of them. Unless a Biden administration, if that's what happens, is forced to not do that.
Well, thank you all to our panelists and to our participants for joining us. We also want to invite you to participate in our upcoming event on October 27th at 2 to 3 p.m. Central, 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific. It'll be focused on Latinx higher education and discussions of affirmative action at HSIs. So we look forward to having you there with us, and thank you very much for taking your time to engage in this discussion, specifically to Donovan, Cesar, and Lisa. I've really enjoyed this, so thank you all. And to everyone out there, we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye.